Hi, welcome back to Focal Point AFR Talk. Brian Fisher is my name. Free for all Friday. We'll have Bradley Dean from You Can Run, But You Cannot Hide on at the bottom of the hour. Talk about an effort by gay activists to get him bounced from the Minnesota State Fair unsuccessfully, it turns out. But once again, we see where the real intolerance is coming from in the entire debate. Now, yesterday morning, Floyd Lee Corkins II, he was sentenced by a federal judge in the District of Columbia to 25 years in prison. And what he was sentenced for was going into Family Research Council a year ago last August, and shooting the place up. I mean, he had 50 rounds. He had a bunch of sandwiches. He would take Chick-fil-A sandwiches, shoot people, rub the sandwiches on their faces as they lay dead on the floor. He was stopped by the bravery of the guy who was manning the front desk. Leo Johnson was his name. Now, this is the first case of domestic terrorism in D.C., the first prosecuted case, the first conviction of domestic terrorism in Washington, D.C. You'd think this would be big news. Do you know that the major networks last night, ABC, CBS, NBC, and the major newspapers did not even cover it? Let's see, New York Times. Remember, the New York Times says, hey, all the news that's fit to print, they ignored it completely, this sentencing. And the Washington Post ran a story, but it ran on page B3, and the Washington Post story made no mention of the role of the SPLC, the Southern Poverty Law Center, that they played in the attack. Remember, this guy was following a so-called hate map that he found on the Southern Poverty Law Center's website. So he found FRC on their hate map, and he went there and started shooting the place up. Not a word of that in the mainstream media. Now, over in England, you know, one of the things I've said, and my conversation with Bradley Dean at the bottom of the hour will illustrate this. I said this repeatedly, that the battle between religious liberty and homosexuality is a zero-sum game. Every advance of the homosexual agenda comes at the expense of religious liberty. And we're seeing this in England right now. There's a couple over there, Hazel Mary and Peter Bull. They ran a bed and breakfast. They've been running this thing since 1986 according to Christian principles. They do not rent a room with one bed in it to a couple that isn't married. Doesn't matter what their sexual orientation is. Doesn't matter what their sex is. Her own brother, the Mrs. Bull, when her own brother comes to stay, he has to stay in a separate room from his girlfriend. That's just the rules. They apply it even to their own family. Well, there was a homosexual couple came to their place a couple years ago. They were miffed that they weren't allowed to sleep in the same bed. They sued. They won. And this couple now has basically been put out of business, just like that baker in Oregon got put out of business by the vitriol of the homosexual activists. These people got death threats. They experienced vandalism. They had bolts removed from the wheels of their car. They found a dead rabbit nailed to their fence. Death threats. There is a hotel database called Visit England that took the name of their bed and breakfast off the list, so tourists had a hard time finding him. Their case is before the Supreme Court in the UK, but they aren't going to last that long. They've got the place up for sale. They went hungry last year. They went cold in the winter because they simply had no business. We're going to have to choose, ladies and gentlemen, between homosexuality and religious liberty. For myself, I choose religious liberty. But it's a reminder, we got to fight this battle every inch. We can't give a single solitary inch to the forces of homosexual activism. Now, this brings me to a very disturbing story. I've got a column up at rightlyconcerned.com about this. This is the main thing I want to talk about in this segment. I'm going to bring Jeff Reed in here in a couple of minutes to talk about another element of this whole issue. We now have, a lot of people don't realize this because it's gotten hardly any attention, but ladies and gentlemen, sodomy-based marriage, same-sex marriage, homosexual marriage, has been legalized, quote, unquote, in all 50 states by a bureaucrat. I kid you not. Tom Perez, arch liberal, came from the Department of Justice where he worked for Eric Holder, who is an out-and-out racist. Eric Holder is just an out-and-out racist. He's not going to prosecute any case if the victim is white. He's made that very clear. If it's voter fraud, the victim is white, I don't care, not going to prosecute it. So very selective in the justice he's concerned about. And Tom Perez had a high-ranking position. Now he's over the Department of Labor. And he issued a ruling this last week that said that every employer in the United States of America This is every employer in all 50 states. If they have a homosexual couple that's married, in other words, they went to one of the 13 states that does recognize same-sex marriage, they got married there, and then they came back to the state they're living in now and working in, one of the 37 that doesn't recognize same-sex marriage, their employers are obligated, according to the Labor Department, to give them spousal benefits. They have to. They don't have a choice. Labor Department says you got to do it. If it's pensions, they got to be on the pension plan. If it's a 401k, they got to be on the 401k plan. If it's health insurance, they got to get health insurance benefits, just as if they were married under marriages that are recognized by the state constitution and state law. So realize now, in essence, that same-sex marriage has been legalized by a bureaucratic tyrant, some pointy-headed bureaucrat in a corner office in Washington, D.C. has just imposed, by bureaucratic fiat, imposed same-sex marriage on the entire United States of America. Now, any employer, what's going to happen? There will be employers that will say, look, I am actually prohibited from doing this by my state constitution. I can't do it. The Constitution, our state constitution, our state law is very clear. The only domestic union that's going to be recognized in this state is a marriage between a man and a woman. Those spouses are the only ones that are eligible for benefits according to our state constitution, according to our state law. So they will say, look, I'm not going to do it. I don't care what the Labor Department says. Our state constitution is not going to let me do it. Congress hasn't said I got to do it. Supreme Court hasn't said we got to do it. This is some pointy-headed bureaucrat in some cubicle in Washington, D.C. telling me I have to do it. I don't have to do it. I'm not going to do it. And what's going to happen is Tom Perez is going to run over to his good buddy Eric Holder in the Department of Justice, and they will land on that employer like a falling safe. They will sue him till they are bled dry, intimidate, harass, persecute, prosecute, until they have brought every employer in the land under submission to this. So here's how it happens, ladies. It's happened, and you haven't heard a thing about it because the media has been virtually silent about this. And Tom Perez, I give him props for this. He knew when to introduce this change. Everybody's talking about Obamacare. Everybody's talking about the vote to defund Obamacare. Some people are talking about Benghazi. Some people are talking about Syria. People are talking about the debt ceiling. There's just not enough bandwidth in the media and in the minds of the American people to process this. But this is earth-shaking. This is earth-shattering. Same-sex marriage has just been de facto legalized in all 50 states by a pointy-headed bureaucrat sitting in a cubicle in Washington, D.C., and hardly anybody even knows about this. But that is, in effect, what has happened. So as I wrote in my column, it's no longer we the people. Remember, we the people, first three words in the Constitution. It's no longer we the people. It's now we, the black-robed oligarchs, and we, the pointy-headed bureaucrats. This is not what the founders had in mind. Now, I want to bring in Jeff Reed to talk about something else. As you remember, I had Peter LaBarbera on earlier in the week to talk about the fact there's astonishing revelation from the Centers for Disease Control, which is not part of the vast right-wing conspiracy. Centers for Disease Control releasing their findings that of males between the ages of 13 and 24, you got a lot of them have been infected with HIV, and according to the CDC, the mode of transmission, the means by which these 13 to 24-year-old males contracted HIV was through having sex with other males. This is an absolute bombshell. It is proof positive that HIV is a gay disease. And Jeff, we have some websites that track us, and you kind of observed an interesting feature in the wake of that segment of our program I interviewed with Peter LaBarbera.
Yeah. Right Wing Watch is one that will, well, let's just put it this way. Google Right Wing Watch and you will see their first page come up. You have your own category there. They follow you daily.
They troll me. They cyber stalk me.
Absolutely. And what they do is they take some of our videos that we post, which actually make good sense, where you're making good points, and they'll label it in such a way that it makes you sound like you shouldn't be paid attention to.
And the interesting thing to me is I'll often retweet or I'll tweet out what they do, because the segments that they use often, if I was going to pick one, that's the one I would pick. So they're helping me get helping me get the word out.
And you can tell the people that are watching these and reading this aren't even watching the videos. They're just going by the title that they put on the article. Or anyways, they've been following you, and they find anything and everything to criticize you about. For some reason, they completely ignored this story. I mean, that to me, I've been following, your social media for years now, and been watching them and watching other places that comment on you on a regular basis. This one, they didn't want to touch.
Well, it's a striking thing because, for them, this was a twofer because they go after Peter LaBarbera.
Yeah.
Peter LaBarbera has been engaged in this culture war longer than I have, and they go after him hammer and tongs. So here they've got a twofer. Got both of us on the program at the same time talking about this HIV age. And let me ask you this question, Jeff. I got my own theory about this, but why do you think that they completely glossed over this segment of the program?
It didn't fit their narrative. They're very pro-gay, and these facts right here were hard to argue with. They didn't. It was hard to twist a title on this one.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's just like what we saw with that soundbite I played with Rick Perry being interviewed on Crossfire by Stephanie Cutter, who's a hard-wing leftist, and
Yes.
Rick Perry kept using fact after fact after fact, statistic after statistic after statistic, and she finally got tired of it and said, "I'm just going to change the subject."
Yeah. Well, that's kind of what they did here by ignoring it.
Yeah. Well, it's, and again, the facts are indisputable. This is from the Centers for Disease Control. It's not something that Peter made up, not something that I made up. It's not research that the American Family Association did, not research that the Family Research Council did. It's the Centers for Disease Control. You cannot argue with it. Mode of transmission for males aged 13 to 24 that have HIV 94 to 95% of the time through male-to-male sexual contact. And I think the thing it tells me, Jeff, we spend all this money. I said this to Peter. We spend all this money trying to convince teens not to take up smoking. It's time we started spending that same amount of money to convince teens not to take up homosexual conduct.
Amen.
All right. Well, thank you, Jeff. I appreciate you bringing that to our attention. Focal Point AFR Talk. We'll be right back with Bradley Dean of You Can Run, But You Can't Hide. Talk about what gay activists tried to do to him at the Minnesota State Fair. Stay with us. You are listening to Focal Point, Free for All Friday on AFR Talk.